The biting cold seized the ravaged city, a skeletal monument to industrialized death. Late autumn in Stalingrad was a landscape composed entirely of ash and frozen mud, coating the shattered remnants of industry and home alike. The air tasted perpetually of spent propellant, pulverized concrete, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Senior Captain Anatoly Volkov arrived at the alleged kill site deep within the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant ruins, the administrative order sealed tightly in his pocket, its contents a mandate to confirm a myth. Volkov was not a battlefield soldier. His expertise lay in the cold geometry of truth extraction and bureaucratic verification, a representative of the political necessity that governed the Soviet counteroffensive. The scene was centered around a specific pile of rubble, an observation nest painstakingly constructed for what the intelligence reports claimed was a high-value German sniper. The hero, Zaitsev, was already history, a name whispered with reverence and dread across the Volga trenches. Volkov's explicit task was not to celebrate, but to confirm the granular details of the kill that had recently galvanized the entire front: the elimination of the German master marksman, Major Koenig. The narrative of the duel had already been crafted, perfect in its tension and its ultimate triumph, reinforcing the idea that even the most elite fascist killers could be outmatched by the people's soldier. Volkov stepped carefully over a snapped wooden beam, his worn leather boots crunching on icy shrapnel. The area, usually abandoned after initial evidence collection, felt heavy with expectation. The body had been retrieved days ago, but the shallow depression where it lay was still marked by splintered wood and a fresh scattering of defensive fire. The accompanying medic pulled back the shroud, revealing the remains that were supposedly irrefutably identified as the elusive major. Volkov's gaze settled immediately on the uniform. The identifying insignia had been hastily removed, perhaps taken as a trophy, but the remaining tailoring was too coarse, too roughly mended for a high-ranking officer in a specialized unit. The man beneath the canvas looked ordinary, exhausted, his face grimaced not in the terror of sudden death, but in the sustained anguish of long deprivation. His hands, frozen rigid, showed calluses consistent with continuous labor, less the refined grip of an elite marksman and more those of a radio operator or a low-ranking NCO. Volkov understood the necessity of legend in a war that devoured men daily. Zaitsev's success was vital for morale, turning an endless siege into a personal vendetta against the enemy command. But the truth, if compromised, represented a fundamental weakness that Volkov's superiors would not tolerate. A fabricated duel implied deceit, jeopardizing the very foundation of the hero's rising status. The investigator meticulously examined the trajectory markers left by shell casings near the German firing aperture, standard 7.92 mm rounds, nothing exotic. The angle of fire suggested a genuine confrontation, certainly, but the debris pattern around the body complicated the simple, elegant narrative of one shot, one kill. The official story was clean. The forensic evidence was stubbornly messy. Volkov felt the familiar chill of doubt, colder than the Russian winter, settling around his mission. He had to prove the legend true, or uncover the necessary lie, all while treading lightly around the enshrined figure of the celebrated sniper. His procedure began with the quiet removal of the unidentified body's dental records, a small, clinical gesture against the backdrop of a colossal tragedy. The dead man carried no standard military identification, only a faint, stylized tattoo etched poorly onto his inner forearm, a symbol Volkov had never encountered, hinting at a unit far more esoteric than any standard Wehrmacht division. This single, unusual detail was the immediate loose thread in the otherwise perfectly woven tapestry of propaganda. If this man was not Major Koenig, the duel was a manufactured event, and the real German antagonist remained somewhere in the rubble, or perhaps had never existed at all. The investigation into the truth of the most famous shot of the war had begun, an inquiry into the fine line separating justifiable heroism from necessary deception. The investigator returned to the command bunker, carrying the sealed records and the image of that strange, serpentine tattoo burned into his memory. The bunker was a hub of manic activity, thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of field radios relaying fresh casualty numbers. The military hierarchy demanded the story remain undisputed. Volkov was tasked with locating the original spotter who had first tracked Koenig, the man who had supposedly witnessed the lethal outcome. This man, Corporal Dmitry Igorov, a specialist in optical tracking, had been abruptly transferred out of the sector hours after the reported kill, a timing Volkov found suspicious given the urgency to solidify the facts. The trail of the only witness led west, deeper into the contested territory, suggesting a deliberate attempt to remove him from the immediate inquiries, or perhaps placing him in a position of immediate, unavoidable danger. Volkov began assembling a detailed map of the duel site, marking blast radii and observation lines. The official reports stated Zaitsev had taken the shot from the southern flank, capitalizing on a brief moment of daylight glare. Comparing this claim against the observed trajectory, Volkov noted a significant discrepancy. The impact pattern on the wall above the German sniper's position suggested a flatter, more direct line of fire than the reported trajectory allowed. If Zaitsev had fired from where he claimed, the round would have struck lower. This geographical impossibility added another layer of concrete doubt. The search for Corporal Igorov became the immediate priority. Volkov used his internal connections to trace the transfer order, discovering it had been authorized by a high-ranking political commissar attached directly to the regional command, a clear indication that the official narrative was guarded at the highest levels. This was no simple military inquiry. It was an exercise in political damage control. The investigator secured a requisition for a vehicle and a small, trusted escort, preparing to drive through territory under intermittent German artillery fire just to interview a corporal whose testimony could either shatter or confirm the national morale-boosting story. Tracking Igorov led Volkov to a field hospital nestled in the ravaged outskirts of the city, where the flow of wounded was relentless and overwhelming. Igorov, Volkov discovered upon arrival, was not there as a patient, but had been assigned to auxiliary duty, ostensibly managing supply lines. Volkov found him hauling crates of medical supplies, his face gaunt, his hands trembling, not from the exertion, but from acute, untreated psychological trauma. Igorov's initial reaction to seeing the investigator was not surprise, but naked fear, the look of a man who believed his past actions had finally caught up to him. Volkov led Igorov away from the chaos, towards a derelict storage shed that offered a pretense of privacy. The corporal's initial statements adhered strictly to the established narrative. Major Koenig, the deadly duel, the triumphant shot. However, as Volkov gently pressed him about the specific details of the German's identification and the actual moment of the kill, Igorov's composure fractured. The corporal confessed that he never saw Zaitsev fire the final shot. He had been ordered to confirm the target's identity based solely on the high-powered German scope recovered later, and had been explicitly instructed by the political officer to identify the deceased body as Major Koenig, regardless of the physical evidence. The body found was simply a casualty dressed to fit the story. The real Koenig, Igorov insisted, was an abstract threat, never definitively located, a ghost used to terrify the local troops. This revelation completely overturned the foundation of the public heroism. Zaitsev had killed a German soldier, certainly, but the duel, the myth of the elite versus elite, was manufactured. Volkov knew the penalty for disseminating this truth would be severe, both for himself and for Igorov. He pressed the corporal on the strange tattoo seen on the body. Igorov recoiled, recognizing the symbol instantly. He revealed that it was the marker for a special detachment of German intelligence officers disguised as elite snipers, a unit used primarily for strategic disruption and high-value target assassination, far more politically dangerous than a mere marksman. The man Zaitsev killed was indeed dangerous, but he was a spy, not a duelist. The new knowledge placed Volkov in an impossible position. he had uncovered a politically motivated deception designed to bolster national resolve. Reporting the fabrication would undermine the war effort and lead to his own execution for treasonous behavior. But allowing the lie to stand felt like a moral abandonment of the truth he was sworn to uphold. He decided the original body and its esoteric markings were the key. He had to find out who this unnamed German spy was and what his actual mission had been. The focus shifted from disproving Zaitsev's shot to understanding the broader strategic game the German High Command was playing, a game that utilized false identities and deception. Volkov returned to the command bunker under the cover of a freezing night, the fear of discovery lending a sharp clarity to his thoughts. He bypassed the usual channels, accessing the restricted German prisoner interrogation logs. He searched specifically for any mention of the specialized tattoo, filtering results through captured intelligence documents related to the German General Staff's clandestine unit. He found a single, cryptic reference, a unit designated Nebel, mist or fog, composed of operatives trained to infiltrate and sow political discord. Their mission: to locate and assassinate critical Soviet political leaders hiding within Stalingrad's civilian population centers, simultaneously boosting their own morale by broadcasting false victories. The dead man was not Major Koenig, but a high-level assassin on an objective that transcended mere tactical warfare. The documents revealed that the Nebel unit had been tracking several targets, the most prominent being a regional party secretary who oversaw the civilian evacuation efforts. Volkov realized that Zaitsev's duel, even if staged, had inadvertently disrupted a critical German intelligence operation. By eliminating the operative, regardless of the assumed identity, Zaitsev had unknowingly protected a vital Soviet political figure. The lie had saved a life, creating a moral paradox that Volkov struggled to reconcile. He faced the difficult choice: expose the fabrication to maintain procedural purity and risk damaging morale, or endorse the lie, thereby upholding a vital strategic advantage and securing his own survival. Volkov chose silence regarding the staged duel, burying Igorov's confession and the evidence of the identity mismatch. The propaganda surrounding Zaitsev continued unabated, a necessary falsehood in the face of unimaginable devastation. However, Volkov subtly altered his official report. He validated the kill but emphasized the strategic importance of the target as a highly dangerous counterintelligence agent, subtly shifting the focus from a personal duel to a crucial strategic victory against German espionage. This maneuver satisfied the political commissars, reinforcing the image of Zaitsev as a defender not just of soldiers, but of the entire Soviet structure. In the ensuing weeks, Volkov worked to quietly neutralize the potential repercussions of the deception. Corporal Igorov was given a medical discharge and relocated far behind the lines, his silence ensured by both gratitude and terror. The dental records of the unidentified operative were filed under a classified designation, never to be cross-referenced with standard casualty lists. The legend of Zaitsev cemented itself in history, fueled by heroism and the necessary, protective shadow of a lie. Volkov watched the sniper become a symbol, understanding that in the absolute horror of Stalingrad, truth was a luxury few could afford. The war machine ground on. The ruins of the city eventually fell silent, the smell of burning oil replaced by the slow thaw of spring. Years later, Volkov, now promoted and distanced from the battlefield's moral compromises, would occasionally see images of Zaitsev, hailed as the ultimate symbol of resilience. He never spoke of the discrepancy, the missing Major Koenig, or the specialized intelligence operative buried beneath the rubble. He simply remembered the sight of the esoteric tattoo, a tiny, serpentine image on a frozen arm, a physical reminder that even in the most celebrated acts of heroism, the shadow of deception and hidden agendas often played the final, determining role. The narrative of the war was one of survival, and sometimes, survival required the careful construction of a powerful, enduring myth. The immediate strategic fallout of Volkov's concealed findings began subtly to reshape regional policy. The elevation of Zaitsev, despite the factual compromise, created an unexpected, potent rallying point, one the political machine was eager to exploit beyond mere morale boosting. Now, observe the ripple effect this manufactured heroism had on rival unit. Previously fragmented sniper teams, working in isolation across different sectors of the collapsing city, suddenly found themselves pressured to replicate Zaitsev's mythological kill ratio. This intense, competitive mandate introduced a severe procedural hazard. Pressure led to exaggeration, and exaggeration led to fabrication. Consequently, reports flowing up the chain of command began to exhibit alarming discrepancies. Numerous claims of enemy specialist eliminations flooded the daily logs. One particular report from the Krasny Oktyabr factory sector detailed the supposed takedown of another high-ranking German officer, complete with recovered binoculars and a detailed account of the engagement. Volkov, privy to the original Zaitsev deception, knew instantly that these subsequent claims were likely derivative fictions, attempts by field officers to garner political favor or secure better supply allocations. The truth had become secondary to the appearance of success, turning the investigation from a search for facts into a constant vetting of performance theater. Building on this, Volkov recognized a pattern emerging in the reported locations of these alleged high-value kills. They consistently occurred near key defensive choke points that were suffering from critical personnel shortages. By reporting a definitive German defeat in those areas, officers could temporarily stave off relentless attacks, buying time for reinforcements, or, more cynically, justifying a tactical retreat due to the elimination of the threat. The fabricated narratives were serving a localized, short-term tactical function, exploiting the central myth for immediate operational gain. Another crucial layer involved the material implications. The official verification of a high-value kill triggered immediate, substantial rewards, enhanced rations, specialized equipment, and above all, the coveted Hero of the Soviet Union medal nomination. This system inadvertently incentivized corruption. A quiet investigation revealed cases of officers appropriating standard enemy casualties, stripping them of ranks and insignia, and staging the scenes to fit the necessary criteria for a heroic nomination. The cycle of necessary lies was thus perpetuated, transforming what was intended as an honor system into a black market for manufactured bravery. Consider, for instance, the case of Lieutenant Boris Chernov, lauded for eliminating a supposed German tank commander. Volkov dispatched a reliable operative, disguised as a logistics inspector, to review the evidence. The operative found that the commander's body was not found in or near a tank, but rather miles away, dressed in non-standard issue winter gear. The accompanying report, written in Chernov's hurried hand, described a fierce, dramatic close-quarters fight. The reality was a likely execution of a straggler, repurposed for political mileage. Volkov understood that prosecuting Chernov would expose the fragility of the entire command structure, requiring him instead to quietly neutralize the fraudulent claim through bureaucratic inertia, slowing the paperwork until the front shifted and the details became irrelevant history. The greatest challenge now lay not in uncovering enemy spies, but in managing the internal decomposition caused by the political expediency of the Zaitsev myth. Volkov found himself operating as a censor and a strategic moderator, deciding which lies were permissible for the greater good and which threatened to unravel the entire logistical fabric. This morally ambiguous function exacted a heavy toll, replacing the clarity of objective justice with the constant calculus of necessary compromise. The city consumed not just bodies and steel, but the very moral foundation of those fighting within its ruins. The relentless, frigid wind that scoured the ruins of the city felt to Senior Captain Volkov less like weather and more like the constant friction of the state machine grinding against the fragile bones of reality. His days had dissolved into a continuous exercise in triage, distinguishing between the life-saving lie and the destructive one. The initial deception, the small, specific untruth required to ignite the flame of resistance, had metastasized. It had become a structural flaw, hidden within the very foundation of the war effort, enabling opportunistic actions that were both tactically useful and profoundly corrosive. He navigated this treacherous landscape like a spelunker traversing a cavern supported by salt pillars, every step tentative, every official report a potential tremor threatening total collapse. The system, once designed to measure objective success and reward verifiable merit, now inexorably rewarded the most persuasive narrative. Reports filtering through the administrative lines were no longer accounts of action, but drafts of future legends, polished and trimmed to fit the template established by the nationally celebrated figure. The currency of valor had rapidly depreciated. Officers were trading in fictional glories, their professional advancement purchased with blood, both real and strategically repurposed. This cycle of competitive deceit created an environment where Volkov's true function had utterly inverted. He was no longer an investigator of transgressions, but a curator of necessary myths, ensuring the scale of fabrication remained functional and did not become embarrassingly obvious to external observers or internally paralyzing. He understood that he had become the gatekeeper of this strategic theater, carefully balancing the need for public inspiration against the inevitable private degradation of those who executed the necessary fraud. The psychological weight of this task pressed down on him with the density of shattered masonry. The moral ambiguity he faced daily was far more exhausting than any enemy bombardment. The enemy was predictable, but the truth, once compromised, became an untamed beast that required constant, careful feeding. He had buried evidence, silenced witnesses, and tacitly approved the subsequent, lesser acts of professional fabrication, all to preserve the larger, guiding fiction that kept the front from breaking. This steady erosion of integrity presented a profound existential challenge. Volkov found himself at a crossroads where pursuing moral purity was synonymous with strategic failure, and political efficacy demanded a continuous commitment to theatrical performance. Reflecting on this journey so far, one must acknowledge the terrifying silence of the ethical void he now occupied. The immediate threat of the invading forces was momentarily checked, but the internal mechanisms of justice had been sacrificed on the altar of expediency. The question now was not merely how the conflict would reach its bloody terminus, but what kind of foundation, psychological and structural, would remain when the rubble finally settled. The true, delayed cost of this enforced mythology was yet to be fully paid, a debt accrued in stolen truths and compromised souls, awaiting the inevitable moment of final accounting. The shadows stretching over the snow-covered ruins were long, but the shadow cast by the state's necessary lies was far longer, promising consequences that would resonate deep into the uncertain peace that lay ahead. Decades passed, pulling the ironclad shadow of the war into the distant, reconstructed past. Senior Captain Volkov, now a high-ranking official within the restructured intelligence apparatus, sat in an office far removed from the stench and chaos of the ruined city. His new environment was sterile and silent, framed by clean lines of polished wood and glass, a deliberate contrast to the brutal, chaotic geometry of Stalingrad. He had survived the physical conflict, but he remained forever trapped within the ethical void forged in that freezing crucible. The system he helped protect had rewarded his calculated compromises, granting him security and power purchased with stolen truth. The legend of Vasily Zaitsev, the hero sniper, was now cast in bronze, etched into monuments and taught in school primers. It was an immutable fact of national history, a perfect narrative of Soviet resilience. Volkov saw the annual commemorations on state television and felt a familiar, chilling emptiness. He was one of the few who knew the intricate scaffolding of necessary lies holding that bronze figure aloft. He understood that the real battle he had fought was not against German ordnance, but against the insidious pull of his own conscience, a battle he had deliberately lost for the sake of strategic expediency. The moral cost was not abstract, It was institutionalized. Volkov's daily work, even in peacetime, involved the sophisticated maintenance of these functional fictions, the constant, subtle sanitization of history to uphold political cohesion and state supremacy. The initial lie, sanctioned at the highest level, had established a precedent. Narrative fidelity trumped factual accuracy, cementing an inherent distrust in the very structures designed to uphold truth. He was no longer simply an investigator. He was a gatekeeper ensuring that the historical record remained politically functional, sacrificing objective reality to preserve collective certainty. In the deepest recesses of the Central Archives, beneath layers of dust and classification, lay the sealed file containing the original dental records and the photograph of the specialized serpentine tattoo, the silent evidence of the intelligence operative misidentified as the celebrated Major Koenig. That file represented Volkov's permanent debt, a quiet, metallic ghost haunting the edges of his ordered existence. It was a testament to the nameless man whose death had been strategically repurposed to save countless lives by bolstering the front's morale. He often reflected on the profound, painful paradox born in Stalingrad. Did the strategic gain, the ultimate victory, the survival of the nation, justify the absolute moral expenditure required to achieve it? Volkov knew the answer was yes, not because it was right, but because it was necessary. The ethical purity he had once sought was a peacetime luxury. In the inferno of total war, integrity was a fatal weakness. The lasting, haunting insight he carried was that the greatest acts of heroism often required the greatest acts of ethical compromise. Volkov never achieved redemption. He achieved acceptance of the darkness. The silence in his modern, well-appointed office was not the peace of resolution, but the quiet confirmation of a lifelong sentence. The true hero of Stalingrad was not just the marksman who pulled the trigger, but the mechanism of strategic deception that turned that act into an enduring national myth. History records the triumph, but only those like Volkov carry the indelible memory of the moral calculus performed in the ashes, the final, heavy realization that victory sometimes demands the permanent surrender of the soul. The war ended, but for him, the haunting cost of its necessary lies remained an infinite and unrelenting silence.